My husband refused to believe his kids were terrorizing me. I made him experience exactly what they put me through. I married Glenn 3 years ago after dating for 2 years. He had 2 kids from his previous marriage, Cody, who was 12, and Madison, who was 10 when we got married. During our dating phase, I only saw the kids every other weekend, and Glenn always handled everything. They seemed sweet enough, maybe a little hyper, but nothing crazy. Glenn always talked about how perfect they were, how they got straight A's, how teachers loved them, how lucky he was to have such amazing kids. I thought I was getting this ready-made, perfect family. The second we got married and I moved into Glenn's house, everything changed. The kids went from polite to absolute nightmares overnight. Madison would go into my closet and cut up my clothes with scissors, then tell Glenn I said she could use them for art projects. Cody would delete my work files from my laptop and claim he was just trying to help organize. They'd throw food at the walls during dinner, and when I'd say something, Glenn would laugh and say kids will be kids. When I showed him my destroyed clothes, he'd say Madison was just being creative and he'd buy me new ones. When I lost a promotion because my presentation was deleted, he said I should have backed up my files better. The kids learned fast that Daddy would never believe they did anything wrong. Madison started telling kids at school that I hit her. The principal called Glenn concerned, and instead of asking Madison why she'd lie, Glenn asked me if I was stressed and maybe grabbed Madison too hard by accident. Cody started stealing money from my purse, and when I caught him red-handed, Glenn said Cody was probably just borrowing it and forgot to ask. He made Cody give it back, but also gave him $20 for being honest about taking it. I tried talking to Glenn's ex-wife Kelly about it, but she just laughed and said good luck. That's why she left him. She told me Glenn had been the same way during their marriage, always making excuses for the kids, never letting her discipline them. She said the kids were different at her house because she actually had rules. That gave me an idea. I started planning a business trip that would last 2 weeks. Told Glenn I had to go to Dallas for a major project. He said no problem, he'd handle everything with the kids. The night before I left, I had a conversation with Cody and Madison. I told them that while I was gone, they could do whatever they wanted since Daddy wouldn't stop them anyway. Madison's eyes lit up and she asked if she could paint her room black. I said Daddy would probably love how creative that was. Cody asked if he could have friends over every night. I said Daddy would think it was great he was so social. I left for my trip, which was actually just me staying at my sister's house across town. Glenn called me the first night panicking because Madison had poured black paint all over her bedroom carpet trying to paint the walls. He asked how to get paint out of carpet and I said I didn't know. Maybe he should call a professional. He said it would cost hundreds of dollars, and I reminded him that Madison was just being creative like he always said. The second day, Cody had 8 friends over who broke Glenn's television playing video games too roughly. Glenn called asking if homeowners insurance covered that. I said to check the policy but reminded him how happy he must be that Cody had so many friends. By day 4, the kids had figured out Daddy still wouldn't punish them even without me there. Madison flushed Glenn's car keys down the toilet because he wouldn't take her to get ice cream at 10 p.m. Cody told his teacher Glenn said homework was stupid and he didn't have to do it anymore. The school called Glenn furious, and he had to go in for a parent conference where they showed him 8 missing assignments. Glenn called me crying that the kids were out of control. I asked what he meant since his kids were perfect angels. He said I didn't understand how hard it was to manage everything alone. I said he was probably right and maybe the kids were just expressing themselves. Week 2 was even worse. Madison cut her own hair into a mohawk because some girl at school said it would look cool. When Glenn freaked out, she cried and said he was mean and she missed Mommy. Glenn actually called me sobbing that Madison said she liked me better. Cody got suspended for selling his lunch to other kids and keeping the money, then lying about it. The principal told Glenn this was a pattern of behavior they'd been seeing and were concerned about lack of discipline at home. When I came back after 2 weeks, the house was destroyed. Doorway frames to the kitchen doorway held thick black paint smears, and the living room television screen showed a spider web of cracks spreading from the center. Glenn sat on the couch crying with his head in his hands, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 weeks without me as his buffer. The kids were at Kelly's house for the weekend, which was the only reason Glenn agreed to let me come back at all. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and told me he finally got it. He finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him for 3 years. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. Instead, I felt exhausted and sad that it took destroying our home and manipulating his children to make him see the truth. We spent the first hour just walking through the house cataloging the damage while Glenn explained each incident in a hollow voice. The black paint ground into Madison's carpet cost $800 to even attempt cleaning. The broken television was $1,500, and the plumber charged $300 to retrieve his car keys from the toilet. Glenn told me the worst part wasn't the property damage, but the moment when the school principal called him a neglectful parent who was raising dishonest children. He'd always believed teachers loved his kids, that everyone saw them as perfect angels, and having that illusion shattered broke something in him. I asked Glenn what he wanted to do now, if he wanted me to move out permanently, or if he thought we could fix this. He said he didn't know, but he needed me to understand that he's genuinely sorry for making me feel crazy and alone for 3 years. Glenn's mother, Leanna, called that evening because the school contacted her as an emergency contact when they couldn't reach Glenn during Cody's suspension. She demanded to know what was happening and why her perfect grandchildren were suddenly in crisis. I watched Glenn try to explain the situation to his mother and actually tell her the truth instead of making excuses. Leanna was shocked into silence when Glenn admitted the kids have been out of control for years, and he refused to see it because admitting they weren't perfect felt like admitting he'd failed as a father. Leanna insisted on coming over the next day to see the house and talk to both of us. Glenn agreed because he was too emotionally exhausted to argue, and I think part of him wants his parents to witness what he finally sees. When Leanna and her husband Julian arrived the next morning, their shock at the state of the house was obvious. Julian walked through each room shaking his head while Leanna sat down heavily on the couch and asked Glenn how long this has been going on. Glenn broke down again, telling his parents everything: the cut-up clothes, the deleted work files, the stolen money, the false abuse allegations at the school. Leanna looked at me with something like horror and apologized for all the times she dismissed my concerns as me being too strict or not understanding children. Julian asked the practical question: what's the plan to fix the situation? Glenn admitted he doesn't have one beyond knowing that everything has to change, and I added that I'm not sure the marriage can survive even if the parenting situation improves. Leanna suggested family therapy right away and offered to pay for it since this is partially her fault for raising Glenn to think children should never be disciplined. Glenn looked surprised that his mother was taking responsibility, and I realized this was the first time I've seen anyone in his family actually acknowledge a mistake. We scheduled an emergency family therapy session for the following week, but the therapist wanted to meet with Glenn and me alone first. I agreed because I need a neutral party to help me figure out if I even want to try saving this marriage. Kelly called me directly that evening, which surprised me since we've barely spoken since our first conversation. She said the kids came to her house talking about how Daddy is acting weird and mean now, and she wants to know what happened during my business trip. I told Kelly the truth about the fake trip and my plan to force Glenn to experience what I'd been dealing with. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she wishes she'd thought of that during her marriage. Maybe it would have saved her years of misery. Kelly offered to keep the kids for an extra week while Glenn and I figure things out, and she also offered to back me up with the therapist about the children's behavior patterns. I'm surprised by her support, but grateful because having the ex-wife confirm the problems makes it harder for Glenn to backslide into denial. The first therapy session was brutal. The therapist didn't let Glenn minimize or excuse anything, and she also didn't let me off the hook for manipulating the children as part of my revenge plan. We both left feeling raw and uncertain, but the therapist said that discomfort means we're actually dealing with real issues instead of pretending. Glenn started researching parenting strategies and child psychology articles obsessively, which would be encouraging, except he keeps trying to tell me everything he's learning like it's brand new information. I have to remind him that I've been telling him these exact things for 3 years, and he called me too strict. The house repairs began with the carpet replacement in Madison's room, and Glenn physically flinched when he wrote the check. I don't feel sorry for him because this is a natural consequence of never setting boundaries, and maybe financial pain will motivate him to maintain the changes. Kelly brought the kids back after 9 days away, and the change in Glenn's demeanor when they walked in was immediate. He's nervous and uncertain instead of his usual indulgent self, and the kids pick up on it right away. Madison throws herself at Glenn the second she walks through the door, wrapping her arms around his waist and smiling up at him with those big eyes that usually get her anything she wants. She holds on to him for a few extra seconds before pulling back and asking in her sweetest voice if she can have friends over for a sleepover tonight since they just got back and she missed everyone so much. Glenn looks down at her, and I watch his face go through about 5 different emotions before he shakes his head and tells her no, not tonight. They need to settle back in first. Madison's smile freezes on her face like she's not sure she heard him right. Her eyebrows pull together and her mouth opens a little bit, then her eyes narrow just slightly as she studies Glenn's face, trying to figure out what's different about him. She looks over at me like maybe I put him up to this, then back at Glenn, and I can actually see her brain working through possible strategies to change his answer. She doesn't try any of them, though, just nods slowly and walks toward the stairs without her usual argument or tears. Cody comes in next, carrying his backpack, and drops it right in the middle of the living room floor before heading toward the kitchen. It's something he does every single day, and normally I'd be the one to pick it up while Glenn walked right past it without noticing. This time Glenn calls out Cody's name in a firm voice that makes both me and Cody stop moving. Cody turns around looking confused, and Glenn points at the backpack on the floor. He tells Cody to put it in his room where it belongs, not leave it for someone else to trip over. Cody stares at his dad like he's speaking another language, then glances at me to see if I'm going to intervene somehow. When neither of us moves, he walks back slowly, picks up his backpack and carries it upstairs. His face shows he's figured out something big has changed, but he doesn't know what yet or how permanent it is. Dinner that night feels like we're all sitting on eggshells waiting for someone to crack them. I made spaghetti because it's easy and I'm exhausted from everything, and the kids sit down at the table actually using their napkins instead of wiping their hands on their shirts. Madison twirls her pasta around her fork carefully, and Cody cuts his meatballs into small pieces, both of them watching Glenn out of the corners of their eyes. About halfway through the meal, Madison picks up a piece of broccoli with her fingers, and I see her arm move back slightly like she's getting ready to throw it. Glenn's fork stops halfway to his mouth and he says Madison's name as a warning. She freezes with the broccoli in her hand and looks at him, testing to see if he's serious. When his expression doesn't change, she flicks the broccoli at the wall anyway, probably figuring he'll laugh it off like always. The broccoli hits the wall and leaves a small butter stain before falling to the floor. Glenn puts his fork down very carefully and tells Madison to go clean it up right now. She starts to smile like it's a joke, but Glenn's face stays serious. She asks why she has to clean it up, and Glenn says because she threw it there. Madison's smile disappears and she pushes her chair back hard enough that it scrapes against the floor. She stomps over to the wall, picks up the broccoli and wipes at the stain with her napkin, but it just smears the butter around. Glenn tells her to get a wet paper towel from the kitchen and do it properly. Madison's face turns red and her eyes fill with tears, but Glenn doesn't back down. She goes to the kitchen, gets the paper towel, cleans the wall, then Glenn tells her to go to her room for the rest of dinner. Madison looks at me like I'm supposed to save her, but I just take another bite of my spaghetti. She runs upstairs and slams her door hard enough that the house shakes. After the kids go to bed, Glenn sits on the couch staring at nothing with his hands hanging between his knees. I sit down next to him and wait for him to say something. He finally asks in this quiet voice if that's what parenting is supposed to feel like, if it's supposed to be that hard and exhausting. I tell him yes, that's exactly what it feels like. It's hard and thankless, and you have to do it every single day without giving up. I explain that's why I've been so angry watching him take the easy path of just giving them whatever they want and never making them face any consequences. Glenn nods slowly and says he always thought being a good parent meant making your kids happy, making sure they never felt bad or upset. I tell him that's not parenting, that's just avoiding conflict, and it doesn't help kids learn how to handle real life, where they can't always get what they want. The next morning, I'm in the kitchen making coffee when Madison comes downstairs wearing one of my cardigans over her pajamas. She's done this dozens of times before, just goes into my closet and takes whatever she wants without asking. I'm about to say something when Glenn walks into the kitchen and stops short when he sees what Madison's wearing. He asks her if that's mine, and Madison shrugs and says she was cold. Glenn tells her to go upstairs, take it off, and apologize to me for going through my things without permission. Madison looks shocked and says it's just a sweater. What's the big deal? Glenn repeats himself in that same firm voice from last night, and Madison's face goes through anger, disbelief, and then something close to fear. She pulls the cardigan off right there in the kitchen, throws it on the counter and mutters sorry before running back upstairs. Glenn picks up the cardigan and hands it to me carefully like it's something precious. I take it from him and feel this tiny spark of hope in my chest that maybe he's actually capable of changing, that maybe the last 2 weeks broke through to him in a way 3 years of my complaints never could. 3 days later, the school calls while I'm working from home and Glenn's at the office. The principal says they need Glenn to come in right away, because Cody told his teacher that his dad is being mean to him now and he's scared to go home. My stomach drops because I know exactly what Cody's doing, using the same manipulation tactics that have always worked before. I call Glenn and tell him what the principal said. He's quiet for a long moment, then says he'll leave work right now and go to the school. 2 hours later, Glenn comes home and his face is tight with anger in a way I've never seen before. He tells me the principal and school counselor sat him down wanting to know if there were problems at home. Glenn had to explain that he's been too easy on the kids for years, and he's finally implementing normal rules and discipline. The counselor asked for specific examples and Glenn told them about the backpack, the broccoli, the borrowed clothes, all these tiny normal things that apparently Cody twisted into his dad being mean and scary. The principal said they have to take these things seriously, but they could tell from Glenn's examples that he wasn't doing anything wrong. Glenn told them to call Kelly if they wanted confirmation about the behavioral issues. He's angry in a way I didn't think he was capable of being at his kids, like he's finally seeing how much they've been manipulating him all along. That evening, Glenn sits Cody down at the kitchen table and asks him why he told his teacher he was scared to come home. Cody's eyes immediately fill with tears, and he says in this shaky voice that he didn't mean it that way. He was just upset about having to do chores and it came out wrong. Glenn doesn't soften his expression or his tone. He tells Cody that lying to teachers and counselors about being scared at home is serious, that people could get in real trouble for that kind of accusation. Cody cries harder and says he's sorry, he won't do it again, and normally this is where Glenn would pull him into a hug and tell him it's okay. This time Glenn just sits there and lets Cody cry. He explains that false accusations have serious consequences, and Cody just lost his video game privileges for 2 weeks because lying about safety issues isn't something they can ignore. Cody's crying stops abruptly and he stares at Glenn like he's never seen him before. Cody's shock turns into anger fast, and he stands up from the table so hard his chair tips backward. He yells that he wants to go live with his mom full-time if Glenn's going to be like this. It's clearly meant to hurt Glenn and make him panic and beg Cody to stay. Glenn just nods calmly and says that's fine. They can call Kelly right now and discuss it with her and the family therapist. Cody's face goes pale because this isn't how this is supposed to work. He's supposed to threaten to leave, and Glenn is supposed to apologize and take back the punishment and promise to be nicer. Glenn pulls out his phone and actually starts to dial Kelly's number. Cody says wait in this panicked voice, and Glenn looks at him with his finger still hovering over the call button. Cody mumbles that maybe he doesn't want to live with his mom full-time. Maybe he was just mad. Glenn puts his phone down and tells Cody that threatening to leave every time he doesn't get his way isn't going to work anymore, so he should only say it if he means it. Our second therapy session happens 2 days later, and this time Kelly joins us on video call from her apartment. The therapist asks Kelly to describe how the children behave at her house compared to what she's heard about their behavior at Glenn's. Kelly says at her house the kids do their homework without being asked, they clear their plates after meals, they follow basic rules because she's always had consequences for not following them. She explains that when Cody or Madison try their usual tactics at her place, she doesn't engage with the drama, she just enforces whatever consequence they agreed to ahead of time. The therapist asks Glenn how it feels to hear that his children are completely capable of good behavior, but chose not to show it to him. Glenn's face does this complicated thing where he looks hurt and angry and embarrassed all at once. Glenn admits to the therapist that he feels stupid and betrayed, like his own kids have been playing him for years and everyone else could see it except him. His voice cracks a little when he says he thought he was being a good dad by never making them upset, but really he was just teaching them that manipulation works better than honesty. The therapist nods and writes something down in her notebook. She tells Glenn that the children were responding to the environment he created, where getting what they wanted was easier through manipulation than through honest communication. She says that makes it a pattern he can change rather than a character flaw in the kids themselves. Glenn looks at me, and I can see he's finally understanding what I've been trying to tell him for 3 years. The kids aren't bad, they're just doing what worked in the world Glenn created for them. Now he has to create a different world with different rules, and it's going to be hard and uncomfortable for everyone until the new patterns stick. That evening, Madison comes home from Kelly's house and bounces into the kitchen, asking if she can go to Lily's birthday party on Saturday. Glenn looks up from his coffee and asks if she finished her weekend chores like they discussed. Madison's face goes blank for a second, then she says she'll do them tomorrow. Glenn shakes his head and tells her the rule is chores first, then activities. So if they're not done by Saturday morning, she can't go to the party. Madison's expression shifts through confusion to anger in about 2 seconds. She starts screaming that this isn't fair, that I've ruined everything, that I turned her daddy against her and now he's mean just like me. Glenn stands up and tells her calmly that he's not being mean. He's being a parent, and the rule applies whether she likes it or not. Madison throws herself on the floor, actually kicking and screaming like a toddler, yelling that she hates both of us and wants to live with her mom forever. I watch Glenn's face, expecting him to cave like always, to comfort her and promise she can go to the party anyway. Instead, he tells Madison she can go to her room until she's ready to speak respectfully, and if she's not calm in 30 minutes, she'll lose screen time for the evening too. Madison looks at me like I'm supposed to intervene and save her. I just shrug and tell her she heard what her dad said. She scrambles up off the floor and runs to her room, slamming the door so hard a picture frame falls off the hallway wall. Glenn sits back down looking shaky and asks me if he did that right. I tell him yes, that was exactly right, and he actually enforced a boundary without backing down. He runs his hands through his hair and says that was the hardest thing he's ever done, watching her cry and not immediately making it better. About 40 minutes later, Madison comes out of her room with red eyes and asks quietly if she can still go to the party if she does all her chores tomorrow morning. Glenn tells her yes, and she nods and goes back to her room without another word. After she's gone, Glenn comes to find me in the bedroom where I'm folding laundry. He sits on the edge of the bed and just stares at his hands for a minute. Then he tells me he understands now why I was so angry and desperate. He says watching Madison scream that I ruined everything while he stood there enforcing a simple boundary showed him exactly what I've been living with for 3 years. Every time he gave in to stop the crying or the manipulation, I had to watch and know that he was choosing their comfort over my sanity. He says he's ashamed it took his house being destroyed and his kids going out of control for him to finally see what I was telling him all along. The next therapy session happens on Thursday afternoon, and the therapist tells us she wants to start including the kids in family sessions, but first she needs to meet with them separately to understand their perspective. She schedules individual appointments with both Cody and Madison for the following week. When those sessions happen, the therapist calls Glenn and me in afterward to discuss what she learned. She tells us both kids complained that their dad changed suddenly, and they don't understand why he's being so strict now. Madison apparently cried through most of her session, saying she just wants her nice daddy back. Cody told the therapist that nothing they do is good enough anymore, and they're walking on eggshells all the time. The therapist watches our faces as she relays this information, and I feel Glenn tense up beside me. She explains that from the children's perspective, their behavior worked perfectly fine for years, and then suddenly it didn't, with no warning or explanation they could understand. She recommends we have a family meeting where Glenn explains clearly what changed and why, rather than just reacting to each incident as it happens. She says the kids need to understand that the new rules aren't random or meant to punish them, but are actually teaching them skills they should have learned years ago. We scheduled a family meeting for Sunday afternoon when everyone will be home together. Glenn spends Saturday night writing out what he wants to say and practicing with me. Sunday comes and we all sit down in the living room, the kids on one couch looking suspicious, and Glenn and me on the other. Glenn starts by telling them he made serious mistakes as a parent by not teaching them boundaries and letting them get away with behavior that hurt other people. Madison interrupts immediately, saying she never hurt anyone. I actually speak up before Glenn can and tell her about my destroyed clothes that she cut up with scissors, my deleted work files that cost me a promotion, the money stolen from my purse, and the lies she told at the school that could have gotten me investigated for abuse. Madison's face goes red and she says those were just mistakes or she didn't know better. Glenn shakes his head and tells her firmly that she knew exactly what she was doing and he should have stopped her the first time instead of making excuses for her. Cody jumps in trying to defend his sister, saying everything was just accidents or misunderstandings. Glenn looks right at him and says no, they were choices with consequences that he failed to address at the time. He tells Cody that stealing money and lying about homework and selling lunch at the school weren't accidents. They were deliberate actions that Cody made because he knew Daddy wouldn't really punish him. The kids look at each other with this expression I can't quite read. Maybe they're realizing that their united front of playing innocent isn't going to work anymore, now that Glenn actually sees through it. Glenn pulls out a printed sheet of paper from the folder beside him and tells them this is a list of house rules and consequences that he created with the therapist's help. He reads through each rule slowly while the kids sit there getting more and more tense. No lying, no stealing, no destroying property, chores must be completed before privileges, homework comes before screen time, respectful language is required. Madison starts crying before he's even halfway through the list and says this isn't fair. Glenn stays calm and tells her that fair doesn't mean everyone gets whatever they want. It means everyone follows the same rules and faces the same consequences when they break them. The first week of the new rules is complete chaos. Madison forgets to do her chores every single day and acts shocked when she loses privileges. Cody talks back, constantly testing whether Glenn will really follow through with consequences. Both of them try playing Glenn and me against each other like they used to, telling him I said something I didn't or telling me he promised something he didn't. Glenn catches them doing it twice and adds extra consequences for lying. By Wednesday, Madison hasn't been allowed screen time for 3 days straight because she keeps breaking rules and Glenn keeps following through. She has a breakdown at dinner crying that she just wants things to go back to normal. Glenn tells her this is the new normal, and she needs to adjust her behavior instead of waiting for him to give up. Thursday night, I find Glenn sitting on the back porch looking exhausted. He tells me this is so much harder than he expected, that every time the kids cry or seem genuinely hurt by a consequence, he wants to just let it go. I sit down next to him and remind him that temporary discomfort from boundaries is better than long-term dysfunction. He admits he feels like a bad father when they're upset, like he's failing them by making them unhappy. I tell him that's because he's been measuring success by their happiness instead of their character development. Being a good parent means teaching them to function in the real world, not protecting them from every uncomfortable feeling. He nods slowly and says he knows I'm right, but it goes against every instinct he has. I tell him his instincts got trained wrong by years of taking the easy path, and now he has to retrain them by doing the hard thing consistently until it becomes natural. 2 weeks into the new system, Cody gets caught stealing money from Glenn's wallet. Glenn finds him in his room counting out $20 bills and asks where he got them. Cody tries to lie and say Glenn gave them to him, but Glenn knows exactly how much was in his wallet that morning. Glenn's immediate instinct is to make excuses. I can see it on his face. He starts to say maybe Cody needed lunch money or something for school. Then he stops himself mid-sentence and actually follows through with the consequence they agreed on. He tells Cody he's lost phone privileges for a week because stealing is non-negotiable. Cody starts crying and begging and promising he'll never do it again. Glenn takes the phone anyway and walks out of the room before he can change his mind. I come downstairs the next morning and find Cody sitting on the living room floor staring at the wall where his phone usually charges. He's been without it for 12 hours and looks like he's going through actual withdrawal. Glenn walks past him to get coffee and Cody jumps up following him into the kitchen. I hear Cody's voice getting louder, saying he needs his phone for school, that all his friends are probably worried about him, that this punishment is too harsh for just borrowing some money. Glenn's voice stays level as he reminds Cody that stealing is not borrowing, and the consequence was clearly explained. Cody shifts tactics and starts crying, saying he's sorry and he learned his lesson, and can he please have the phone back now. I stay in the hallway listening because this is Glenn's test, and I need to see if he'll actually follow through. Glenn tells Cody that being sorry is good, but consequences don't disappear just because you apologize. Cody's crying gets louder and more desperate, the kind of performative sobbing that used to make Glenn cave immediately. I hear Glenn set his coffee mug down and walk toward the living room, and for a second I think he's going to give in. Instead, he walks right past Cody and comes to find me in the hallway. He looks exhausted but determined and asks if I can take the kids to the school because he needs a minute. After I drop them off and come back, Glenn is sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He tells me that was the hardest thing he's ever done as a parent. watching Cody break down and not fixing it for him. I sit across from him and wait for him to keep talking. He says for years he thought being a good dad meant making his kids happy, protecting them from feeling bad, solving all their problems before they even felt the discomfort. Now he realizes he was actually teaching them that manipulation works, and consequences don't exist. He looks up at me and says, taking that phone and keeping it taken even when Cody was sobbing felt like the first real parenting decision he's made in years. The next 3 days are weird because Madison suddenly becomes the perfect daughter. She does her chores without being asked, offers to help with dinner, compliments my outfit, asks about my day at work. Glenn and I exchange looks across the dinner table because we both know something is coming. On the third day of this angel behavior, Madison comes into the living room where Glenn and I are watching TV and sits down between us. She puts her head on Glenn's shoulder and tells him she's been thinking about how she hasn't had any new clothes in forever, and all her friends have better stuff than her. Glenn nods and says, okay, they can go shopping soon. Madison sits up smiling and says, great. When can they go? And she has a whole list of stores she wants to hit, and she'll need his credit card because she's not sure how much everything will cost. I watch Glenn's face carefully as he processes what's happening. The old Glenn would have handed over his wallet and told her to have fun. This Glenn pauses, and I can actually see him remembering the therapy session where the therapist warned about exactly this pattern. Kids who've been allowed to manipulate often try being extra good right before asking for something major, testing if the new boundaries are real or if they can still work the system. Glenn tells Madison that he's glad she's been helpful lately, and they can definitely go shopping, but it'll be next month after her good behavior has been consistent for a while, and they'll set a reasonable budget beforehand. Madison's sweet expression cracks immediately. She asks what he means by reasonable budget, and Glenn says they'll figure out an amount that covers what she actually needs, not everything she wants. Madison's voice goes sharp as she points out that he used to let her buy whatever she wanted, and this isn't fair. Glenn stays calm and explains that a lot of things are changing because the old way wasn't working. Madison storms off to her room and I hear her door slam. Glenn looks at me and asks if he handled that right. I tell him the therapist would be proud because he just recognized manipulation and didn't reward it. Kelly calls me directly 2 days later, which surprises me because we usually only talk through Glenn about kid logistics. She sounds tired and says the kids have been complaining to her nonstop about the new rules at our house. Apparently they've been asking if they can live with her full-time because Daddy is being mean now, and everything is different and they don't like it. I ask what she told them, and Kelly actually laughs, a real genuine laugh, and says she told them her house has the same rules, and they can't escape expectations by switching homes. She tells me Cody tried to argue that she lets them do whatever they want, and Kelly had to remind him about her chore chart, her homework requirements, and the time she grounded Madison for a week for lying. The kids apparently looked shocked, like they'd forgotten their mom actually parents them. Kelly says this is the first time in the 8 years since the divorce that she and Glenn are actually on the same page about the kids. She thanks me for whatever I did to finally make Glenn wake up, says she's watched him be the fun, permissive house for years. While she had to be the strict one, and having him finally step up as a real co-parent instead of the place where rules don't exist, means the kids might actually have a chance at turning out okay. Our couples therapy session that week is separate from the family sessions with the kids. The therapist looks at me directly and asks a question she's been dancing around for weeks. She wants to know if I actually want to stay married to Glenn. The room goes quiet and I feel Glenn tense up next to me on the couch. I take a breath and tell her honestly that I don't know. Glenn is changing his parenting and following through with consequences and backing me up for the first time in 3 years, but I don't know if I can forgive 3 years of being gaslit and unsupported. 3 years of my clothes being destroyed and my work being sabotaged and being called too strict while Glenn made excuses for everything. 3 years of feeling like I was going crazy because he refused to see what was happening right in front of him. The therapist nods and asks what would need to happen for me to even consider staying. I tell her I need to see if these changes stick, or if Glenn backslides the first time the kids really push back. I need to know this isn't just temporary guilt and shame that'll fade once the house is repaired and things calm down. I need to see him maintain boundaries when it's hard, not just when he's still scared from those 2 weeks alone. Glenn speaks up then, and his voice is shaky. He tells the therapist he understands if I want a divorce, that he wouldn't blame me after everything he put me through, but he's hoping I'll give him a chance to prove the changes are permanent, not just a reaction to crisis. The therapist asks what that would look like, and I think about it for a long minute. I tell them I need at least 6 months of consistent follow-through before I can even consider whether trust can be rebuilt. 6 months of him backing me up when the kids act out, enforcing consequences without me having to push him, being an actual partner in parenting instead of another obstacle. 6 months of him choosing our marriage over protecting the kids from their own behavior. Glenn nods and says he can do that. He will do that. The therapist reminds us both that 6 months is just the evaluation point, not a guarantee, and we both need to be prepared for whatever decision comes at the end of that time. A month passes with the new system in place and the school calls. Glenn answers and I watch his face change as he listens to whoever is on the other end. He thanks them and hangs up looking stunned. I ask what happened, and he tells me that was Cody's teacher calling with positive feedback. She says Cody's behavior has improved noticeably over the past month. He's been turning in homework consistently, participating in class more, and she wanted to acknowledge that whatever changes are happening at home are making a real difference. Glenn just stands there holding his phone, and I can see his eyes getting wet. He sits down heavily on the couch and tells me he never realized how much damage his permissive parenting was doing beyond our home. He thought as long as the kids seemed happy and he avoided conflict, everything was fine. He didn't connect their behavior problems at the school or their manipulation tactics with friends to his refusal to give them structure. Hearing a teacher call with praise instead of complaints made him understand that his children are actually capable of functioning well when they have boundaries, and he's the one who's been holding them back all these years by protecting them from consequences. I sit next to him feeling a complicated mix of validation and sadness. Validation because someone outside our house is confirming what I've been saying for 3 years. Sadness because it took a teacher calling to make Glenn really see the broader impact of his choices. I've been telling him this exact thing since we got married, and he dismissed me every time. But a teacher he's never met calls once, and suddenly it all clicks into place. I don't say any of this out loud because Glenn is already processing enough, but I file it away as something to bring up in therapy. The fact that he needed external validation to believe me is part of the bigger trust issue we're dealing with. Madison gets invited to a sleepover the following weekend, and comes to ask permission instead of just announcing she's going like she used to. She actually stands in the kitchen doorway and waits for Glenn to finish what he's doing before speaking, which is new. She tells him her friend is having people over Friday night and she wants to go. Glenn asks basic questions like whose house, will parents be there, what time should he pick her up? Madison answers each question without attitude or eye-rolling, and Glenn tells her yes, she can go, he'll drop her off at 7 and pick her up at 10 the next morning. Madison nods and starts to leave, then turns back and thanks him. After she's gone upstairs, Glenn looks at me and comments on how different that interaction was from her usual pattern of demanding things and throwing fits when she didn't get her way. I point out that having structure and knowing what to expect actually makes kids feel safer, even when they fight against the boundaries. Madison seemed almost relieved to have Glenn verify the details and set a pickup time instead of just winging it like he used to. The family therapist meets with all of us the next week and starts by saying the kids are making real progress. Both Madison and Cody are developing better coping skills and learning that manipulation doesn't work anymore. But she warns us that regression is completely normal, and we shouldn't interpret backsliding as failure of the whole system. She emphasizes that changing family patterns takes months or years, not weeks, and consistency matters way more than perfection. There will be days when Glenn forgets to enforce a rule or gives in when he shouldn't, and days when the kids figure out a new manipulation tactic. The important thing is getting back on track quickly, instead of letting one slip turn into abandoning all the changes. She looks at Glenn specifically and tells him that he's doing hard work that goes against years of ingrained habits, and he should give himself credit for the progress while staying committed to the long-term goal. 2 months after that first disastrous visit, Glenn's parents come back to the house. I'm nervous about seeing them again because last time they witnessed complete chaos and dysfunction. But when they walk in, the difference is obvious. The house is clean and repaired. There's no food on the walls, no broken items scattered around. The kids are doing homework at the kitchen table instead of running wild. Glenn's mom stops in the living room and looks around with visible relief on her face. She comments on how much calmer everything feels, how the whole energy of the house has changed. We sit down to have coffee, and she asks the kids about school, and they actually answer politely instead of ignoring her or being rude. Cody tells her about a project he's working on, and Madison mentions she made honor roll this semester. After the kids go back upstairs to finish homework, Glenn's dad tells him directly that he's proud of him for doing the hard work of real parenting. He says it's not easy to change patterns and admit mistakes, especially with your own kids, but Glenn is showing up and following through, and that's what matters. I opened my laptop that evening while Glenn watched TV with the kids and pulled up apartment listings in the area. Just looking at options made me feel less trapped, less like I had to stay no matter what happened. I scrolled through one-bedroom places near my office, calculating what I could afford on my salary alone. Glenn walked past to get water from the kitchen and glanced at the screen over my shoulder. He stopped moving for a second, then continued to the kitchen without saying anything. When he came back, he sat down next to me on the couch instead of returning to the TV room. He asked quietly if I'd made a decision about leaving. I told him honestly that I was still deciding, but I needed to know I had a way out if the changes didn't stick. He nodded slowly and said he understood, that he couldn't expect me to just trust him after 3 years of him proving I couldn't. Then he got up and went back to the TV room without trying to convince me to stay or getting defensive. That response actually meant more than if he'd begged. 3 months passed with Glenn maintaining the boundaries and structure consistently. The kids still tested limits, but less often, and Glenn didn't backslide even when they cried or complained. One evening, he suggested we go to dinner alone to talk without the kids or therapists around. We dropped the kids at Kelly's house and drove to a quiet restaurant across town. After we ordered, Glenn started apologizing again, but this time was different from his previous general apologies. He brought up specific incidents with exact details. He apologized for the time I showed him my destroyed clothes, and he said I was overreacting instead of addressing Madison's behavior. He apologized for asking me if I'd grabbed Madison too hard when she told the school I hit her, instead of questioning why his daughter would lie about abuse. He apologized for giving Cody $20 after catching him stealing from my purse, rewarding the exact behavior that should have been punished. He went through maybe 10 specific examples from our 3 years together, each one a moment where he'd chosen to believe his kid's manipulation over my legitimate concerns. He said he'd gaslit me repeatedly by making me question my own perception of reality when I was seeing things clearly the whole time. I felt tears in my eyes listening to him list out these specific moments because it showed he actually understood what he'd done wrong. I told him that his specific apology meant more than all the general ones combined because it proved he'd actually thought about his behavior and recognized the patterns. He asked what he could do to rebuild trust between us. I said keep doing exactly what he's doing now. Consistent parenting, backing me up when the kids misbehave, not making excuses or finding creative interpretations when they do something wrong. I said trust gets rebuilt through actions over time, not through words or promises. He nodded and said he'd keep showing up and following through for as long as it took. Kelly called me a week later with an unexpected suggestion. She wanted the 4 adults to meet together to discuss coordinating rules between households. Her sister Ramona would come too since she was involved in the kids' lives and had witnessed their behavior at both houses over the years. I agreed even though the idea of sitting down with Glenn's ex-wife and her sister felt awkward. We met at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning while the kids were at a friend's birthday party. The first few minutes were tense with everyone being overly polite and formal. Then Ramona broke the tension by joking that it only took Glenn's house being destroyed for him to finally listen to both his wives. Everyone laughed, including Glenn, and the atmosphere relaxed. Kelly said she'd been thinking about how the kids had different rules at each house and could play the parents against each other. She wanted to establish consistent expectations so the kids couldn't escape structure by switching homes. We spent 2 hours at that coffee shop creating a shared list of rules and consequences. Chore requirements were the same at both houses, including specific tasks the kids had to complete daily and weekly. Screen time limits matched so the kids couldn't binge devices at one parent's house after being restricted at the other. Consequences for lying or stealing were identical no matter where the behavior happened. Bedtimes, homework expectations, and respectful communication standards all aligned between households. When we picked the kids up from the party and told them about the new coordinated system, both of them complained immediately. Madison said it wasn't fair that she couldn't have different rules at Mom's house. Cody said they were ganging up on him, and Kelly was supposed to be the cool parent. Kelly told them firmly that's exactly the point. They need stability and structure everywhere, not chaos at one house and rules at the other. Having all the adults on the same page meant they couldn't manipulate or escape expectations anymore. 4 months after my fake business trip, Madison came home from the school with her report card. She walked into the kitchen where Glenn and I were making dinner and put the paper on the counter without saying anything. Her grades had improved from mostly C's and D's to B's and 1A. The conduct marks showed better behavior, and the teacher's comments mentioned Madison was participating more in class and being respectful to other students. Madison stood there trying to act like she didn't care, but I could see she was proud of herself. Glenn looked at the report card and told her he was proud of her effort and the improvement she'd made. He didn't go overboard with excessive praise or treats for meeting basic expectations like he would have before. He just acknowledged her work appropriately and said he hoped she'd keep it up. Madison nodded and took the report card back, and I saw a small smile on her face as she headed upstairs. A few days later, Cody asked Glenn for help with a school project instead of just not doing it or lying about it being done. Glenn sat down with him at the kitchen table, and they worked through it step by step. Glenn asked questions to help Cody think through the problems instead of just giving him answers. Cody actually listened and took notes and worked on the project seriously for over an hour. I watched them from the living room where I was reading and felt something shift in my chest. This was the first time I'd seen them interact as parent and child in a healthy way since I'd known them. Glenn was actually parenting, setting expectations, and helping Cody meet them. Cody was actually being a kid who needed guidance instead of a manipulator working his dad. It gave me hope that maybe the changes really were sticking. The family therapist did a check-in session the following week with all 4 of us. She said we'd made significant progress over the past several months, but recommended continuing therapy for at least another 6 months. She explained that the kids were developing healthier coping skills and learning to communicate their needs instead of manipulating to get what they wanted. Glenn was maintaining boundaries consistently, which gave the kids security even when they fought against the structure. She emphasized that these were the foundations of lasting change, but the family needed continued support to prevent backsliding into old patterns. Everyone agreed to keep attending sessions regularly. That night after the kids went to bed, Glenn and I had a serious conversation about whether I was ready to commit to staying in the marriage. He asked me directly if I'd decided or if I was still considering leaving. I told him honestly that I saw real change happening, and I was willing to keep working on rebuilding trust between us. But I needed him to understand that one backslide into old patterns, and I was done. If he started making excuses for the kids again, or dismissing my concerns, or choosing their manipulation over our partnership, I would leave immediately. I wasn't going to give him multiple chances to prove he'd changed because I'd already given him 3 years of chances before my fake business trip. He said he understood completely, and he knew he was getting one opportunity to show the changes were permanent. We agreed to think of this as a new relationship starting now, rather than trying to fix the broken one from before. Glenn suggested we renew our vows privately once we'd made it to a full year of healthy patterns, as a way to mark the real beginning of our marriage. I was surprised to find myself actually considering it instead of immediately saying no. A year felt like enough time to know if the changes were real or just temporary effort. If we made it that long with consistent parenting and mutual support, maybe a vow renewal would feel right. A few weeks after that conversation about renewing our vows, Madison knocked on my bedroom door while I was folding laundry. She stood in the doorway picking at her fingernails and asked if I could take her shopping for new clothes. I said sure and started to grab my purse, but she stopped me and said she wanted to apologize first for cutting up my clothes 3 years ago. She said she knew it was mean and she was sorry and she'd been saving her allowance money to help pay for replacements. I told her I appreciated the apology and we could definitely go shopping, but she needed to understand that actions have consequences even when we're sorry about them later. I said she could use her allowance money to pay for half of whatever we bought, and I'd cover the other half. Madison nodded and actually seemed okay with that arrangement instead of arguing like she would have months ago. We went to the mall that Saturday, and she picked out clothes carefully, checking price tags and doing math in her head to figure out what she could afford with her share. It felt like shopping with an actual responsible kid, instead of the destructive nightmare who used to demand everything she saw. The next week, Cody came home from the school looking nervous and went straight to his room without his usual snack. Glenn noticed and went upstairs to check on him. I heard them talking through the door and Cody admitted he'd gotten in trouble for talking during a test. Glenn came back downstairs 20 minutes later and told me Cody had been expecting him to call the teacher and make excuses like he used to. Instead, Glenn had a calm conversation about what happened, why the rule existed, and what better choices Cody could make next time. Glenn said Cody seemed almost relieved to have a father who acted like a parent instead of a friend who'd cover for anything. The school called the next day to confirm Glenn's conversation with Cody, and the teacher said she appreciated the united front between home and school for the first time since Cody had been in her class. 6 months after my fake business trip, our house was finally repaired. The new carpet in Madison's room looked perfect. The replacement television worked great, and all the other damage from those 2 weeks was fixed. The kids were doing better in the school with consistent homework completion and improved behavior reports. Glenn had maintained the boundaries without any major backsliding, though there were still occasional tests that he handled appropriately. I found myself feeling cautiously optimistic about our future together for the first time since we'd gotten married. I knew we'd always need to stay alert about old patterns trying to creep back in, but the changes seemed real and lasting instead of temporary effort. Glenn and I celebrated our progress with a quiet dinner at home after the kids went to Kelly's house for the weekend. He made pasta and we ate at the kitchen table with candles, something we hadn't done since before we got married. He told me he was grateful I hadn't given up on the family even when I had every right to leave. I said I was glad he finally opened his eyes to what was really happening. I told him that watching him become the father his children actually needed instead of just their friend had made me fall in love with him again in a completely different way than before. He reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat there quietly finishing our wine. The house felt peaceful in a way it never had during those first 3 years, and I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like.